Imagine being locked up in a psychiatric hospital without actually being sick. How could you possibly prove you're sane? That's exactly what a group of psychology students experienced in the 1960s during Rosenthal's experiment. In 1963, psychologist Robert Rosenthal wanted to explore how expectations influence our perception of normalcy. To do this, he placed students in a psychiatric hospital and told the staff that some patients were schizophrenics in the middle of a crisis. In reality, only a third of those patients were truly ill. The rest were psychology students pretending to have symptoms. The results were startling. The psychologists indeed perceived the labeled patients as more disturbed and sicker than the others, even though these patients showed no real symptoms. The psychologists described the labeled patients as more agitated, bizarre, and delusional than others, even when their behavior was identical. For example, a labeled patient walking back and forth in his room was seen as agitated and paranoid. Meanwhile, an unlabeled patient doing the same thing was described as thoughtfully pacing. This difference in perception stems from the power of expectations. The psychologists expected the labeled patients to be agitated and strange, so they interpreted their behavior accordingly. The psychologists also assigned more severe diagnoses to the labeled patients and predicted they would have longer hospital stays. This tendency to exaggerate the severity of illness in labeled patients could have real consequences for their treatment and diagnosis. Even more striking, the psychologists began to perceive symptoms that didn't exist in the labeled patients. They reported that some labeled patients were whispering among themselves or experiencing hallucinations, even though these symptoms weren't present. This creation of non-existent symptoms is a powerful example of how our expectations can shape our perception of reality. These results demonstrate the powerful influence of our expectations on how we perceive reality. When we expect someone to behave in a certain way, we're more likely to see their behavior in line with our expectations, even if it's not actually the case. Rosenthal's experiment shines a light on the concept of stigmatization, which was developed by Erving Goffman in his work Stigma. A stigma is a social mark that discredits an individual and excludes them from society. In the case of Rosenthal's experiment, the psychologists stigmatized the labeled patients as schizophrenic. This stigma led to a biased perception of their behavior and discrimination against them. Goffman's work highlights the harmful effects of stigma. Stigmatized individuals often face prejudice, discrimination, and social exclusion. They may also internalize the stigma and develop a negative self-image. Rosenthal's experiment has significant implications for our understanding of normalcy and madness. It shows us that normalcy is a social construct that shapes our perception of reality. Rosenthal's experiment reveals that normalcy isn't objective but a social construct shaped by our cognitive biases. This awareness is crucial in fighting stereotypes and discrimination. Our expectations can influence our perception of reality and lead us to erroneous conclusions. Therefore, it's essential to be wary of our own biases. Rosenthal's experiment isn't an isolated case. Many other studies have shown the influence of our expectations and biases on how we perceive the world. Notable examples include Goffman's work and Milgram's experiment. Normalcy seems to be an illusion.